something about the state of the world and where we're heading and where we have been. I've been around for some time, somewhat older than you are. And as a matter of fact, when I was born in a world of 2.5 billion people. And at that time, a long time ago, most of those people were living in rather desperate circumstances. Roughly 80–90% of the population of the world were living in what was seen as absolute poverty of the one sort or the other. And the development in the decades since then have been spectacular in a number of ways. We are now close to 8 billion people. This tremendous expansion of global population. The global economy has risen by X times. But the most significant aspect is, if you look at the distribution of income and possibilities in that particular world, there were the fears in those days, going back to a long time, that we should see rapidly rising global inequality, fewer richer countries and people sinking down into poverty. That is not what has happened. It's the other way it has happened. Today we have a situation that roughly 80–90% of the population is out of poverty. They might not be rich by our standards, but they are not absolutely poor. We have roughly 10% remaining in that desperate situation. But the fact that we've been able to expand, or global population has expanded tremendously, the global economy has expanded tremendously, poverty has been reduced, but also X numbers of other social indicators. We have, if you just take the decade since roughly 1990, when we gave a new boost to global cooperation of different sorts with the fall of the Soviet Empire, since then, we've cut child mortality in half. We have reduced X numbers of diseases. So the increase in global well-being, in global longevity, in global prosperity has been astonishing. I think that is worth saying, since otherwise, when we look at global affairs nowadays, we look at more at the problems that are there, that are substantial, but we should be aware of the magnitude of the positive challenges there have been. In fact, I often say that, or sometimes say that, and there's a famous quote from, I don't know if you read, you probably haven't read it, the famous book about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire by Gibbon. It's 6 volumes, so I don't expect, I haven't read it all. I would have put there, I haven't read it all either. But there's a famous line that it says that from that particular period in the Roman Empire to that particular period in the Roman Empire, it was probably the best period of humanity ever. And I'm sort of challenging that sometimes and say, perhaps these decades, from sort of the 80s leading up to sort of 10–15 years ago, were among the best periods in human development ever, in the terms of absence of major wars, global social, economic and social progress. Spectacular period in global human development, rivaling perhaps those particular decades that Gibbon spoke about or wrote about in his book about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. But it is fairly obvious that we are now in somewhat more difficult times, and that's been going on for some time. I normally make this sort of the period when things started to change around 2008. You can take it sort of plus, minus, or whatever, where we had a number of things that were happening. We saw the beginning of wars, Russia versus Georgia. We saw the global financial crisis, the collapse of Lehman Brothers and all of the follow-on effects that had, enduring, by the way, on the state of the global economy. As we saw more clearly, the Beijing Olympics, the rise of China, a very confident China, based on its economic success, also with a political ambition on the global stage. Since then, challenges have been proliferating, and I think we have now come in, particularly since 22, and the Russian aggression against Ukraine, in a profoundly dangerous period when it comes to the global development, and that makes it challenging to look ahead. Where are we 10 years from now? Where are we 20 years from now? Where are we 30 years from now? It is more uncertain to make estimates about the state of the world a couple of decades ahead than it been when we have been doing it in the previous decades, and they have been fairly dramatic, as you know. I think there are two major tendencies that we see. The one is the very profound rise of global challenges, and at the same time, the rise of global geopolitical tension. And the real problem is how to handle the global challenges, which we need to handle together, at the same time as we have rising geopolitical challenges, which undermines the possibilities of working together. The challenges that are there are fairly obvious, I think. We just went through a pandemic, and that had, on the official figures, 15 million people dead. That's quite a lot, 15 million people. But that's official statistics. The real figure is probably 3 or 4 times that number if you take all of the people who died out in countries where statistics is less than reliable. And we were still lucky with that particular pandemic. We were lucky because we managed, or were lucky enough, to find a vaccine much, much faster than one normally does. We were not particularly good at distributing those particular vaccines in an equitable manner around the world, but we did anyhow do that. And we were lucky in the sense that the pandemic wasn't that deadly as previous ones have been. I often make the comparison between the SARS pandemic, also COVID. I mean, COVID was called COVID-2. COVID-1 was the SARS epidemic or pandemic in 2003. That was significantly more deadly, but significantly less contagious. COVID-2 was less deadly and more contagious. And there are a number of structural factors that makes it more likely that we will have pandemics coming in the future. And we need to be prepared for something that might be as deadly as COVID-1 and as contagious as COVID-2. Would we be able to handle that with the present state of global cooperation? The answer to that question is no, we would not be able to handle that. There's ongoing negotiations in Geneva and New York for a new pandemic treaty, as it's called. It's going to be called something else at the end of the day, in order to increase the preparedness, the global cooperation, to perhaps be able to handle that. But those negotiations are, as most things are in the world today, filled with problems, and whether they will live up to what is needed remains, mildly speaking, remains to be seen. Second global challenge that we have is obviously climate change, which is a huge transition that is needed. If we look at it from, two angles. The one is, of course, the fact that we need to limit the increase in global temperature to 1.5 degrees by 2050. That's the Paris Agreement. And that's what science says, that that's going to be problematic, but it's manageable if we can limit it to that. Well, on present trends, we're heading for 2.8. And that is not manageable if that were to occur. Now, it's not going to be 2.8 because present trends are not going to continue. Things are changing. We are taking action. Europe is making a transition, the only part of the world that is really making it the serious way, to net zero by 2050, a reduction by 55% to 2030. But the world is a big place. And we have massive increases in emissions still from primarily China, primarily India, but also from others. So there's a lot that needs to be done in order to bring emissions down. COP28, the next of these conferences, will meet in Dubai in the beginning of December. I think the latest I heard was 15,000 people coming there, which seems to be rather unmanageable, I have to say. But anyhow, is it going to be possible there to take further steps to reduce the use of fossil fuels or to reduce the climate effect, the emission effect of the use of fossil fuels? That remains to be seen. And there are sort of different perspectives on it in different parts of the world. From the developing countries or emerging countries or whatever you prefer to call them, they look at the cumulative, I mean the amount of emissions that is out there, up in the atmosphere, because it stays there forever, more or less. And they say most of that is coming from you, the industrialized world. You did this during the last 200 years, so you have to pay us for this. While we tend to say, well, that's not the relevant thing. The relevant thing is, where are they coming from now? And then we point at the Chinese and the Indians, primarily. So that's going to be the Dubai tension between them looking at everything that's up there, that's industrialized world, and we say, it's you that needs to bring down now. You can see the tension coming out of that. And then the third global challenge that should be mentioned, challenge, it's not only challenge, it's also enormous promise, is of course the fact that we are in a period of very profound technological change. It's a technological revolution that is going on, and a scientific revolution, which, I mean, we are all living with our iPhones and iPads and laptops and whatever, unthinkable before. Reminded of the story of which I like, Kristalina Georgieva, who's head of the IMF nowadays. She has a lovely story of when she was trying to tell her grandchildren, I guess it was, sort of how these technologies were, and trying to explain to them that she was brought up in a world where they didn't exist. There was no internet, there were no computers, there were no mobile telephones. One of these young falls down in complete silence, stunned, and after a while of thinking said, yes, but you had iPads. They couldn't even think of a world in which we didn't have these technologies that we have today, but we have them. And that's just the beginning. We are now in the discussion phase quite a lot of what's going to be the impact of artificial intelligence. What's going to be the impact of quantum computing within 10 years of different sorts? What's going to be the impact of synthetic biology, which could be even more revolutionary, and combined it with quantum computing, and combined it with artificial intelligence? And it opens up prospects that are both immensely promising for mankind, but also immensely challenging. I mention this is in the category of challenges, because as we have a discussion on AI, you need to have some norms and values and some rules for how to handle this. And if we have such in separate ones in Italy and Switzerland and France, it's fairly obvious that is completely ludicrous, has no effect whatsoever. But the same applies on the global scale. If we have separate ones in Europe, the United States and China, completely ludicrous, there's no effect whatsoever. But you can also see the difficulties of sitting down between very different parts of the global economy and global political system to get agreements on these particular things. Nevertheless, absolutely essential to do. But all this in a period of rising geopolitical tension, caused by a number of factors, but also profound shifts in global power between the major actors. And you could, without simplifying too much, but simplifying somewhat, then of course we have a Russia that fears its own decline, and a leader of Russia who wants to strike back in order to reverse that decline and try to go back to a Russia that is a global, or at least a regional power with an imperial stretch that was there sometime in the past. And that has of course resulted in a very major war in Europe. Then we have a China that has been rising in an absolutely spectacular way. It's spectacular in size, not necessarily what they've done, because the path of development of Chinese economy is not too dissimilar to what we saw in South Korea, what we saw in Taiwan, when they started to liberalize their economies. It's the same upward trajectory. But of course, if you do this in a country of 1.4 billion people, it does change the nature of the global economy. We now have a situation where a third of global demand this year is coming out of the Chinese economy. A third of entire global demand is coming out of the Chinese economy. That was virtually unthinkable 20 or 30 years ago. And then this China is, of course, assertive, rightly and wrongly. Wrongly in the sense that it does represent a fundamentally different ideology in terms of values and human rights and political rights than we have. Rightly in the sense that they tend to say, well, go back 200 years in time. Before the Industrial Revolution, we were probably the biggest economy in the world. We and the Indians. And you Europeans were down there in the dust. Well, not quite dust, but anyhow, you were down there and we were dominant. So what is happening now is that we're restoring the global order as it was before the Industrial Revolution. And why should we then operate within a global system that you dictated in 1945 with the powers that were dominant at that particular time? Why is France, to take one example, in the UN Security Council, why not India? Is there a logical answer to that particular question? No, it's not. It's a reflection of the world as it used to be. But they are saying we need to adjust the word and the word structures to the powers that are there today and to the global populations that are demanding their influence as well. This is obviously not necessarily that popular in those countries that have perhaps to retreat somewhat and to have to adjust to the different other realities. And that is, of course, primarily the case with, or before going into that, just mention concerning China as well, that of course they have very major challenges ahead. They face, I remember a number of years ago, I was in a meeting in Beijing with Xi Jinping. He had just been appointed Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party, and he gave a presentation to a fairly limited group. And he said, it's sort of rather perceptive, the man is not stupid. He said that we face two major challenges in the years ahead. One is to avoid what is called the middle income trap. And that is in development theory, you might be aware of it. I mean, sort of you do develop, you catch up with technology, you liberalize the economy, you progress rather well, but then you sort of, there's a risk of you becoming stuck somewhere. You can't make the next step. The Latin American countries are good examples of being stuck in the middle income trap. And that's normally somewhere between 10,000, 15,000 dollars per capita. That's where China is. And the task is then to sort of continue the economic reforms in order to continue upwards. Will he be able to do that? Well, I think his economic policy so far has been to the detriment of the positives of avoiding the middle income trap. But let's wait and see where they develop. The other challenge is what's called the Thucydides trap, which you might be aware of. Thucydides, the Greek historian who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War. And he has this famous phrase that it was the rise of the power of Athens and the fears that this instilled in Sparta that made war unavoidable. It wasn't that the Athenians or the Spartans were wishing for war or planning for war, but it was the fears of the change that made, if you go back to the Peloponnesian War, made minor incidents on the, if I remember it right, the sort of the ally assignment between Corinth and Corfu that suddenly sparked a conflict that sort of upset the entire ancient world in the Peloponnesian War. And the same we've seen X numbers of times before in history, where the rise of one power that unseats another power that has been dominating leads to war. And to avoid that is, of course, of fairly fundamental importance. And that is, of course, what the Americans to a certain extent fear. They have been by far the dominant power of the world since the 1870s, when they replaced Britain as the dominant economic power in the world. And primarily, of course, since 1945, they've been enormously dominant on the global stage. In 1945, they had nearly 50% of global GDP. It's been less now, they're down to half of that. But they still, and of course on the basis of this, they've also built a military might that is very impressive. And what they fear is, of course, that this China over time, if its economy develops, replaces the American economy as the #1 in the world. You can discuss if that's already the case. In nominal terms it is. And you can discuss in real terms whether it will happen or when it will happen. But if it happens, they fear that over time that will also translate into military power and to political influence and significantly challenge American power and the American Western global international order that has been built. The United States is a power that is accordingly somewhat questioning, can we remain the dominant power in the world in spite of the rise of China? And how can we handle the different political global responsibilities that we have undertaken or have done? And you can see America going back and forth between immense ambition and quick retreat. It doesn't really have the endurance. You can go into the Vietnam War, leave that particular war, and nearly forget about it. You can go into Afghanistan, immense war, leave and nearly forget about it. Go into Afghanistan, immense efforts, then leave it quickly and nearly forget about it. I mean, it's an optimism. They can do things, but not necessarily the endurance all the time. And then you have the divisions that we now see in American society on the role that they are going to play. A more traditional role, Joe Biden and this particular presidency, more reflective of the consensus of American politics as we've seen it through the last few decades, challenged by a Trump and a part of the Republican Party that at the end of the day don't really care about the world. It is America first, and insofar as the world exists, it is significantly thereafter. And you see that reflected both in its approach to security policy and its approach to trade policy and its approach to the value questions that are important to us as well. Where the United States goes in these respects will of course be of fundamental importance. And in this era of significant changes in global power, we also see the rise where things are less stable than they used to be. We see the rise of other powers that are beginning to assert themselves. India, significant act on the global stage. The Indian economy is growing by 70% a year. It's the fastest rising, fastest growing major global country. In a couple of decades, on present trends, the economy of India will be equal to the economy of Europe. We hadn't really thought that was possible some years ago, but that's where we're heading. Turkey is clearly assertive. It's 90 million people. It's a big place with the most impressive demography of European countries. I wouldn't make any direct comparison between the demography and demographic prospects of Italy and demographic prospects of Turkey, just to say that they're very different indeed. And that will have an impact a couple of decades down the road. And you might have others coming down the line. Indonesians, the Nigerians, the Brazilians. They're going to be part of the global orchestra, global concert in a much more decisive way than has been the case before. But as I said, in this area of uncertain power relationships, rising and declining powers, it opens up space also for different conflicts that have been frozen or contained for longer or shorter periods of times. And that, to put it mildly, we've seen only in the last few weeks And if you take just the last 3, 4, 5 weeks, we had first sort of an outburst, very minor you might add, in northern Kosovo. 3 people dead, not much by the standards of the day. But even a couple of dead can inflame tensions between nations and upset efforts at achieving, in this particular case, some sort of normalization, some sort of realignment, reconciliation between Serbia and Kosovo, set back Balkan developments in this particular crucial aspect quite substantial. And then immediately thereafter, by the way, the same days as the leaders of the world assembled in New York for the opening of the general debate of the UN General Assembly, you have the Azeris undertaking a new military offensive in southern Caucasus to capture Nagorno-Karabakh, the Armenian enclave inside Azerbaijan, that they lost control of in the wars in the connection with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. Decisive, quick military campaign, sweeping to the side, completely Russian peacekeepers that were there, being victorious in a couple of days, and then forcing or encouraging 120,000 people to depart the homes that they've had for generations, and do that in just a couple of days, and then descending on Armenia, which, whether it has the capacity to take care of all of these people remains to be seen. And then, of course, since last Saturday, we have an outburst of a new round of the conflicts between Israel and Palestine, in this particular case Hamas versus Israel, with a phase of the conflict that is still escalating, highly uncertain, highly dangerous, highly deadly. I make the comparison somewhat with what we saw on the 7th of October and what happened 50 years earlier, when Israel was caught by complete surprise on Yom Kippur, when the Egyptians, the Syrians, and the Jordanian armies coordinated, but primarily the Egyptian army attacked. Of course, the Israelis had in the previous wars, the 67 war, controlled the Sinai Peninsula. The Egyptian army crossed the Suez Canal. Israel was caught completely unaware, stared the possibility of defeat in the face for a while, managed to turn it around, crossed the Suez Canal in the other direction, and nearly defeated the Egyptian army. But international diplomacy brought the conflict to a halt before there was any truly decisive outcome of the war. That was the last time that Israel faced an existential threat to its existence since 1948. An existential threat in sort of big armies launching big attacks on it. Because what happened thereafter was a recognition by the political leaders of the region that this can't really go on, and we need to do something differently. And we had a step-by-step development during the 2 decades that followed, with the one good step after the other. The normalization between Israel and Egypt was absolutely key. Diplomatic relationships, peace. Eventually, President Carter negotiated the withdrawal of the Israeli army from Sinai. We got a normalization diplomatic relationship between Israel and Jordan, immensely important for the stability of the region. It failed at the end of the day with Syria, but it was very, very close that there was an agreement with Syria as well. And then they also started to tackle the root cause of the problem, and that is the Palestinian issue, and brought the then terrorist organization PLO discreetly to the negotiating table, and ended up with the Oslo Agreement in 1993, which opened up the door to peace and a 2-state solution, where an Israel, or the Israel, and a Palestinian state could live in peace with side by side with each other, perhaps even sharing Jerusalem as the common capital. That was an astonishing 2 decades of developments in the right direction. So to say, the 3 decades since then have been different. And perhaps starting with the assassination of the Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1996, sorry, just 3 years after Oslo Agreement. Jewish extremists said, I don't want peace with the Arabs. I want to win against the Arabs, and Rabin is a traitor. And then, of course, the rise of the fundamentalists on the Palestinian side say, we don't want peace. We want victory over Israel. Hamas, only part of that, but the most significant part of it. And we saw the marginalization of the leadership that was interested in going forward with peace, with a stronger role from Hamas on the Palestinian side, with the settler movement, very sort of partly very extreme on the Jewish side, continuing its illegal settlements on occupied Arab land, gradually undermining the two-state solution. And then we arrive at the 7th of October, where we had the pressure cooker exploding in the form of the attack by Hamas out of Gaza. So where are we heading now? Well, it's not easy to say what's going to happen in the next 2 days. But it's even more difficult to say what's going to be the case in 2 months, or in 2 years, or in 2 decades. Israel will go into the Gaza Strip, try to take it over, try to destroy the structure of Hamas. They will succeed with that. Because Israel is overwhelming military superiority. But at what price remains to be seen, and which will be the consequences further down the line. That we don't know. And there's a lot of caution that is being argued in dialogue with Israelis on that particular. And what happens thereafter? Gaza is a city, Gaza itself, as Gaza Strip is 2.3 million people. Gaza City up in the north is 1.1 million, as not what might be large standards, but fairly significant cities. And they are now being bombed more heavily than we've seen anything being bombed since 1945. And people are encouraged to and forced to leave, obviously, but what do you do thereafter? Who's going to govern the ruins after the end of the war? Are people going to be allowed back into the ruins, if that is even possible? If they're not going to be back into the ruins, where are they going to be? 2.3 billion people. And how do you prevent Hamas from, or someone else, even worse, from rebuilding that particular terrorist infrastructure that they successfully built up, even during the period of a fairly significant blockade of Gaza since 2007. There are many, many more questions than there are answers to these particular questions. And we have significant diplomatic activity going on at the moment, primarily from the American side. Secretary Blinken has been touring, I think, 5 Arab countries. He's in Jerusalem as we speak. The US president is arriving tomorrow in first Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and then Amman to meet the Jordanian, the Palestinians, and the Egyptian leaders to see what can be done. I think there will be a recognition, and that's the only ray of hope I have. Recognition, perhaps like 1973, that this can't go on. If we don't do anything different, it's not going to be peace, it's just going to be a pause until the conflict is there again in the one way or the other. So perhaps there will be a resumption of some sort of attempt to create a framework for development towards stability and perhaps eventually peace for the region as a whole. That's going to be more difficult now than it was in 1993 at the Oslo time, and that due to the very high emotions that are there. I'm coming this morning from talks in Abu Dhabi, And I can sort of testify to the fact, and you see it on television, that emotions are running fairly high. In Israel, understandably so, but also in the Arab world. And we see the effects on the streets of Europe as well, with the tragedy in Brussels. Perhaps part of that yesterday. Europe is in the middle of all of this. We have a profound interest in an open global economy. The fact that we are as prosperous as we are is because we have an open global economy. We are traders. We are the #1 trading power in the world if you take it in relative size. In absolute size is us and the Chinese. The Americans somewhat less. They are the innovation power of the world. We are trading powers. And we have a fundamental interest not to avoid the fragmentation of the global economy, and to preserve an open global economy from our perspective. We have a fundamental interest in living in a world where both we have reconciliation and peace and stability within Europe, and reconciliation, prosperity and stability in the near abroad of Europe. The Russia-Ukraine war is inside Europe. That needs to be sorted out. And it needs to be sorted out based on the fundamental principles of which are fairly simple. You are not supposed to invade other countries. It's simply not tolerated. It can never be accepted. Because if it's accepted, then it is accepted, and then it will happen again, somewhere else or there. And that's going to demand further efforts from our side to help Ukraine to withstand the Russian aggression and eventually pave the way for some sort of peace order, which must be based on change in the Kremlin. Putin will be history at some point in time, bad history, but history. And Ukraine will be a member of the European Union some years from now, and then we will have the possibility of stability there. We have a fundamental interest in stability of some sort in the Middle East as well, because it is very nearby in a number of different respects. And we also have an interest in the development of the continent of Africa, which will be increasingly important in the decades ahead. We've seen the demographic and political rise of Asia in the decades, but as we know, China has passed the peak in demography. India is going to continue to rise for a couple of more decades, but it's really the rise of Africa that counts. To the year 2000, not that long ago, not all of you might remember it, but I do remember it. At that time, the population of Europe and Africa was roughly the same, 500 million. They are now 1 billion, and they are continuing to rise. We will soon have 40% of the working age population of the world in Africa. 40% of the working age population of the world is going to be in Africa in a couple of decades. How is that going to be handled? Can we create better conditions for the economic development of Africa? And what's going to be happening if it doesn't succeed in doing that? And we also see the instabilities of Africa. We've seen a series of military coups to the south of Sahel during this year, or during the last few years, but pronounced this year, and the rise of tension from different, primarily Islamic groups that are undermining the stability of the already fragile, already fragile nations of that part of the world. So the European challenge ahead is going to be quite substantial. We need to make certain that we don't lose out in the technological, scientific transition that so far is dominated to a very large extent by the Chinese and by the Americans. We need to be able to safeguard the internal cohesion of our cooperation in Europe. We need to be able to safeguard the stability of the east of Europe and Africa and the Middle East. And all of this will require far more of European cooperation. The big question mark hanging over this is, of course, what's going to happen in the United States. and with that relationship that is critical to European security. We don't talk too much these days, it was different in the Cold War, about nuclear weapons. But we are dependent upon the deterrent effect of American nuclear weapons in order to balance Russian nuclear weapons that are still there in substantial number. And then we are also dependent upon American power in a number of other respects. But if this political system of this American power becomes increasingly unpredictable, then of course there are major question marks over that particular relationships that will have to be handled as well. I think I stop there. I might have given some food for discussion anyhow. And just to say to you that as you look ahead at your sort of future careers and future prospects and future things, it's going to be interesting. That's the mildest one can say about it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.